Look, are we going to go to war with China or not? I mean, that's the question on a lot of people's minds right now, because it turns out that the State Department has deleted a key phrase about our stance over Taiwan. And China is not very happy about it. In fact, China has issued something of an ultimatum to Donald Trump. And we all know how well Donald Trump does with ultimatums from foreign countries who don't have the same military economic capacity of the United States. So it is going to be interesting to see what happens, because this kind of falls into one of those categories with Donald Trump, right? There's going to be some people on the right that are screaming right now going, why are you saber rattling with China? Why are you making an already volatile situation with Taiwan potentially even more volatile by doing this? What's the point of it? And I would argue that the point is we're not sure yet. Because one thing I've learned is that when Donald Trump says something, when the Donald Trump administration does something that we didn't anticipate, the best thing to do is to usually wait a couple days and to see what actually transpires. But this just happened and it's just too interesting to talk about. So today what we are going to do is go through, we're going to talk about what the State Department deleted. We're going to talk about why it's significant. And we're going to talk about why Taiwan is both significant to the CCP as well as being significant to the United States and what it could potentially mean for our relationship with China, not just from a trade perspective, but also, is this something that could potentially lead to hostilities? All of that and more coming up on this episode of Making the Argument. I'm your host, Nick Freitas, member of the Virginia House of Delegates, but other than that, a reasonably good guy most days. With me in the studio, my beautiful bride, Tina, Queen of the Bees.
Hello, everyone.
And then, of course, we have our resident historian, our political prognosticator, the Oracle of Virginia, Christian Hines. How you doing, Christian?
I'm doing well.
So this is the sort of thing Christian and I would just sit there and geek out on.
We have been for the past hour.
We have been as we're going over this, but we got to give Tina the credit for actually bringing this to our attention and putting a lot of things together, because I wasn't supposed to be here in the studio. I was supposed to be in Richmond today, and I'm thrilled that we got off the floor early. I was able to come back home, and here we are talking about this.
Oh, I can't take credit for it. I put together a loose outline and then kicked it over to Christian, and then he added all the meat to it. So.
Oh, look at that, Tina
wow,
making sure you got credit. I was just going to give all the credit to the person I'm sleeping with, but that was nice that she also. That's you, honey. By the way.
I just gave you like the perfect segue for
Nick
a
totally
Good Ranchers
missed-
ad, and he missed
He
it.
totally missed it. You didn't catch the meat reference?
No. When Tina says meat,
because I
my
always
mind
talk
goes
about
somewhere else.
meat in
Full
Nick's
context,
presence.
audience. This episode is brought to you by Good Ranchers.
It is true. It is brought to you by Good Ranchers. And in fact, if you would like to get Good Ranchers, because maybe you've never tried it, maybe you've been watching this program for a while now and still haven't tried Good Ranchers because you're wondering if it's actually worth it. The answer is yes, it's actually worth it. How do we know? Because we eat Good Ranchers almost on a daily basis within the Freitas household. They have some of the best beef, pork, poultry, wild-caught seafood that you could possibly want. And it's all delivered directly to your door. And if you use promo code Nick, not only will you get $25 off that order, but if you sign up for one of those subscriptions, Good Ranchers, being the wonderful American company they are, loving God and country, are going to give you, with your subscription, free ground beef, free poultry, or maybe even free salmon, right? All of that included in your order, right? That they give that free. I don't mean just one time. They're going to give you $25 off that order, but then they're going to give you that for your subscription. So look, I'm just telling you right now, if you want to dabble, maybe you don't want to, maybe you're not ready to marry Good Ranchers. Maybe you just want to date a little bit. Fine, go on their website. They got a lot of things you can do as a one-time order. See if you like it. Guaranteed you will. But then sign up for one of these subscriptions and use promo code Nick, because it's not just good for you. It's not just good for Good Ranchers. It's also good for the show. And if you like what we do here and you want us to continue to talk about things that might get us banned by the good people in social media, supporting us through organizations like Good Ranchers that are willing to take a risk on advertising through us is a great way to do it. So go to goodranchers.com, promo code Nick. Go check that out. Okay. Was that good? Was that a halfway decent recovery?
Yeah, that was good.
Okay. All right.
Good job, honey.
All right, so let's first and foremost, what actually happened, right? So we got the U.S. State Department dropped references to America's opposition to Taiwanese independence. So real quick, we'll stick on that for a second. So what ended up happening was, go ahead and scroll down here a little bit. President Donald Trump's State Department angered Chinese officials last week after deleting a key phrase declaring U.S. opposition to Taiwan's independence. The State Department's fact sheet on U.S. relations with Taiwan had previously stated, "We do not support Taiwanese independence," but the phrase was removed on Thursday and continues to be absent. Chinese officials called on the U.S. to immediately correct its wrongdoing on Sunday, arguing it sends a wrong signal to the Taiwan independence forces. Go ahead and go to the next article here real quick.
I love how they're like, you need to immediately correct this wrongdoing, like as if
all commies talk the same, man. I don't care where you are. I don't care how different the cultures are.
Like they're the victim of something.
All commies always talk from the standpoint of, you must correct your wrongdoing. Has the U.S. changed policy on Taiwan and One China? This again goes into President Trump has so far not indicated a clear direction, but a change of emphasis on independence suggests he will treat Beijing as a strategic rival. Gee, I wonder why. When the United States hinted at the biggest change in its policy toward China in half a decade, everyone missed it. It was last Thursday that someone in the U.S. State Department made changes to the bilateral relations fact sheet, a routine document on U.S. relations with Taiwan. You would have to study the old and new versions closely to spot the difference, and it wasn't until Sunday that media in Taiwan, no doubt altered by their own government, pointed it out. The changes amount to a few sentences, including lines that strengthen the commitment to Taiwan's membership of international organizations from which it is blocked by China at present. But most important were the 6 words that were removed from an earlier paragraph: "We do not support Taiwan independence." So one more article here, because this goes a little bit more into China's response to it.
This is actually an older one that I'm going to get to.
Okay, so here's what we need people to understand about this whole concept of the One China policy or Taiwanese independence. Because I think a lot of people, if you're not someone that's super interested in Chinese history or even Chinese history over the last 100 years, you're probably thinking to yourself, wait a second, isn't Taiwan and China 2 independent nations? And the answer is no, but kinda.
De facto they are.
No, but kinda. Here's what it amounts to. China fought a civil war, right? You had Mao Zedong on one side with the communists. You had Chiang Kai-shek on the other side with the Kuomintang. And for most of leading up pre-World War II, World War II, Chiang Kai-shek's forces, the nationalist forces, were dominating. And then Mao Zedong led the Chinese communists on what is become referred to as the Long March. You hear us talk a lot about the Long March to the institutions. That's actually a reference to Mao's Long March. But essentially, it was able to not only save the Communist Party in China, but really rally a lot of the rural areas to the communist cause, come back and defeat Chiang Kai-shek and Kuomintang. They actually retreated onto what was then called the island of Formosa and set up their own government over there. But what's important to understand is that neither side has ever acknowledged that the other side won. So for all practical purposes, there has always been an ongoing civil war between Taiwan, or what it's actually known as the Republic of China, versus the CCP, right? The Chinese Communist Party and Communist China. So both sides actually claim to be the legitimate rulers of China. And when Nixon, and understand that U.S. policy, especially during the height of the Cold War, there was a significant effort by the United States to try to peel off China from the Soviet Union's influence and orbit. And so this had to do with things like Nixon opening up China and working out deals with Mao Zedong. And then later on, this worked into additional trade deals. And essentially, the United States was, again, trying to drive a wedge between communist China and the Soviet Union, which in many respects was largely successful. Because the Soviet Union was considered the far greater threat to China. And so, again, you had this interesting relationship that took place, but maintenance of that relationship, part of the deal of maintaining that relationship was that the United States also adopted this One China policy. Now, keep in mind, Taiwan also officially has a One China policy, although that's starting to change, and we're going to get into that a little bit later, especially with one of the major political parties. And China absolutely has this policy. Like China, both sides have said forever that reunification is the only acceptable outcome. And so it's in order to view this on why it's such a momentous thing for this to work itself out of the State Department document, you have to understand that for decades now, this has just been This has just been the rule. And even though we all understand that Taiwan operates completely and totally independent from mainland China and vice versa, that's always been the rule. And to challenge it or to even make whispers at it is to drastically upset the international order and specifically the regional order in that part of the world. So even though most Americans are looking at this going, I didn't even realize this was an issue. Believe me, it is. And the fact that the Trump administration really hasn't clarified what the United States' official position is with respect to Taiwan is significant. It's very significant, especially when you consider everything that is going on in Xi Jinping's China right now, because they have some massive problems that they're facing. And the more those problems become pronounced, the more Xi Jinping leans into kind of the more old school authoritarian, totalitarian, Maoist days of China. And so this is significant, but we wanted to give everyone kind of like a quick lay of the land. That's a very, very rough history. But it's something that you need to understand the significance of why this, this omission in the State Department document was such a big deal to China. So having said that, this kind of poses a couple of questions. One is, what do we think? The first thing I want to talk about here is, what do we think Trump's policy is going to be on this? Because I know there's going to be a lot of people, especially in kind of like, I mean, if you think about America First, a lot of America First was rooted on, we're done with the international stuff. We're done with constantly getting involved in foreign conflicts. We're done with sending money all over the place. You would think that Trump's policy would be to just kind of like maintain relationships as they were between China and Taiwan and the United States and China, other than maybe fighting it out on trade policy. But why would you do this when this is, again, when you know that this is something that really agitates the Chinese Communist Party?
I think one of the reasons is because China is one of the only countries. Now, correct me if I'm wrong. Something might have changed in the news since, a couple days ago, because the news cycle's going crazy right now. It's so fast. But pretty sure China's one of the only ones who is not fully capitulating to the extra tariffs. And I feel like Trump is using whatever is in his bag of tricks that he can possibly do to apply pressure to China and every other country. I mean, he's applying pressure to other countries with all kinds of different threats. I mean, look at the Gaza threat. Look at, hey, we're going to buy Greenland. And hey, Canada, you want to be the 51st state. And so I think this might be sort of in that strategy zone. And Trump might be trying to play some kind of 4D chess here. Either that or it was just a freaking typo.
It was very intentional.
Yeah.
I think so.
I want to briefly.
Well, okay, wait. But can we say something very quickly here to Tina's point? And maybe it's just to take it off the table as a consideration. Something like this is so significant that it really can't be a mistake. But we've also talked a lot about this concept of malicious compliance, the idea that you would have some people within the bureaucracy that don't like Trump's policies, that will, again, behave in such a way to where they can maybe superficially claim that they're supporting Trump's policies when in reality they're trying to create problems, right? They're being subversive. I'm going to tell you right now, my opinion is that's not what happened here. I don't think this was an issue of malicious compliance, but
I agree.
I do want to talk more about your first idea.
Yeah,
Christian,
I do think it has to do with that.
Yeah.
So
applying pressure.
There's a bit of tension here because on one side you can say America First means we have to be very hostile to the CCP because they're an existential threat to the United States. There's an ideological divide there. There's an intense rivalry. China wants to supplant America's place as the global superpower. We can't allow that to happen. Therefore, they're the new evil empire, right? We're in another Cold War and we have to beat them. There's another angle that you could go, which is what it doesn't look like we're currently moving in, which is we should actually be pulling ourselves out of the Gordian knot that is the Taiwanese Strait situation, and we should be fostering basically a maintenance of the status quo, that we should be adopting the type of approach to the mainland and the CCP that the KMT has.
Yeah.
And it doesn't seem like we're moving in that direction, but there is that tension that America First could mean one of those two things. It could mean aggressive foreign policy where you're being openly hostile against the CCP, or it could be, this is none of our business. We just need to pull out of this region and tend to ourselves and just maintain the status quo because the status quo is not detrimental to us in this part of the world. You could argue that Trump is kind of upsetting the apple cart on this front, but there's actually something that I want to show you guys briefly.
Yeah.
This is a news article from the New York Post from 3 years ago, almost 3 years ago, May 2022. And it's something very similar to this. The headline is China blasts U.S. over wording change on State Department's Taiwan website. And it goes on to say that China's foreign ministry ripped the State Department this week over word change on an agency web page focused on Taiwan, calling it a, quote, petty act of fictionalizing, according to a new report. On May 5th, the State Department online fact sheet on U.S.-China relations with Taiwan no longer states that Washington, quote, does not support Taiwan independence. It's the exact same thing.
Yeah.
Just a different web page, but it's the exact same thing. It's also through the State Department. It's talking about our relationship with Taiwan. And so the point that I'm trying to get across is we have done this before. Mm-hmm. And this was under a previous administration as well. This was under the Biden administration. And so in some ways, I feel like that this is more of a continuation of a trend that predates what happened a month ago when Trump took office. Mm-hmm. I think that we're moving in this direction regardless of Trump's unique actions. Trump might be accelerating certain things, but I think that the direction that we're moving with respect to foreign relations with China is one that is in some ways larger than any single individual in the Oval Office.
No, and let's look at something here real quick too. This on February 1, fact sheet, this is from the White House. President Donald J. Trump imposes tariffs on imports from Canada, Mexico, and China. And if you look into that, the extraordinary threat posed, this is addressing an emergency situation. The extraordinary threat posed by illegal aliens and drugs, including deadly fentanyl, constitutes a national emergency under the International Emergency Economic Powers Act. And then what he says here is, until this crisis is alleviated, President Donald Trump is implementing a 25% additional tariff on imports from Canada and Mexico and a 10% additional tariff on imports from China. Energy resources from Canada will have a lower 10% tariff. And then it goes on to explain one of the purposes of this. The orders make clear that the flow of contraband drugs like fentanyl to the United States through illicit distribution networks has created a national emergency, including a public health crisis. Chinese officials have failed to take the actions necessary to stem the flow of precursor chemicals to known criminal cartels and shut down money laundering by transnational organizations. And if you go on to this, one of the things that Trump makes obvious throughout is how much more dependent these other countries, to include China, are on the U.S. consumer markets than we are upon their, essentially manufacturing markets or whatever resources that they bring to bear. What he's essentially saying is that they benefit more from trade from us than we benefit from them. That's not to say we don't benefit from trade from them, but their economies are much more dependent on trade with us than ours are on trade with them. And so Donald Trump has largely used the threats of tariffs and things like that in order to get what he wants. Now, to Tina's point, he threatened tariffs on Colombia, not for economic reasons. He threatened it because initially they refused to accept Colombian citizens that were being repatriated. And that's how I'm going to word it now, not just deported, repatriated to their home country where they could, be of great value to their mother nation. Anyway, so he's sitting over there. President of Colombia says no, turns it around because he's going to stick up to Donald Trump. Donald Trump threatens, I think, 25% tariffs, and within between holes 3 and 8 on the golf course, the Colombian president comes back, says, so sorry, did not mean to. Let me send you my presidential plane in order to get those guys. Similar things happen with Mexico and Canada. Like, everyone talked a big game. Trump threatened the tariffs. Mexico and Canada essentially said there's no way we're going to do retaliatory tariffs. And then reality struck, and both of them came to the table within, I think, 48 hours. Took almost no time at all. To Tina's point, China has been a little bit more of a holdout. Now, in part, that's because...
And they have... there's also been rhetoric toward us with that too. They're refusing. It's not just no response. They're really refusing.
Yeah, they're actually sticking to their, all of them gave rhetoric initially. It's just that everybody else capitulated almost immediately. That has not been the case with China. And so I think to Christian's point, not the first time the United States is engaged in this kind of subtle saber rattling, but I do think it's a much different circumstance when Trump does it. Mm-hmm. When other administrations have done things like this, it was almost kind of like a fake shot across the bow. It was something that was irritating to the Chinese, but I don't think they thought it was going to actually materialize in anything more. I mean, maybe additional arms assistance to Taiwan or something like that. With Trump, it's a different game because you don't know exactly what he's willing to do in order to escalate to get what he wants. All you know is that he's very adamant about winning.
And he knows what tools he has.
Yes.
I'm going to also ask a question since this is right in the right zone to ask it. This is from Connor. He says, how will tariffs affect America's relationship with China? Would there be blowback against Canada, so China doesn't just funnel product through there? And it's interesting because there was something with some of these coyotes saying we're no longer funneling people through the south border. We're going to go through Canada.
Yeah.
And so they're advertising that. So it's a good question for that. And there's two more questions once you answer that.
So I want to mention something on that. A lot of times, yes, will countries find workarounds if they find it economically beneficial? Yes, of course. The problem is that any sort of workaround that you do that drastically increases the cost associated with what you're doing is in and of itself a deterrent. And this whole idea, like coyotes saying, oh, we'll just bring them through the northern border. What, you think that's easy? How do you transport them all the way up to Canada first? It's much different to simply walk up, through Central American countries with no real border security who are all too happy to point you in the direction of the United States than it is to ship the same amount of people onto boats and then get them up to Canada. Now, for China, it's a little bit different story, right? Because China there was an influx of illegal immigrants coming from China and predominantly using the southern border. If you try to use the northern border, you can, but you're still going to run into issues with Canada's immigration policy, especially if Poilievre wins the next election, which I think he will. And again, the other problem with this is saying, well, we'll just do it through the northern border. Okay, well, again, that's assuming that Canada is going to be fine with that when, one, Canada is not going to be fine with it, and two, Canada is especially not going to be fine with it if the United States jacks up tariffs, because the Canadian economy is largely dependent on trade with the United States. And so if you think you're going to improve the situation by simply going through Canada, Trump can just apply the heat there in a way that will make sure that the entire Canadian RCMP is making sure that you can't pull that off. And that's a big part of what Trump's trying to do right now. He's trying to motivate countries to do things, which arguably they should be doing already. But now he's trying to create he's got a stick and a carrot, right? And the stick is the tariffs, and that's what he's using in order to prevent them.
Okay, I've got two more questions. I'm going to ask one. You can answer it real quick, and then the other one is slightly off topic. So this one's still on topic. If this is Trump's policy, why has there not been an announcement made about it?
Oh, I think because we're not actually looking at we are not yet looking at a major policy shift. What we're looking at is the kind of like subtle saber rattling that has gone on between the CCP and the United States for some time now. The difference is that there is a real chance that Trump could actually change U.S. policy. The other thing too that's important to understand here is that for the longest time, Taiwan wanted the same policy. For the longest time, the dominant party within Taiwan wanted the one China policy. They weren't necessarily, they obviously wanted America's guarantee of Taiwan's protection against any sort of invasion from the CCP. Okay, but they also wanted one China policy. The difference now is that the dominant party in Taiwan doesn't want a one China policy. They're increasingly moving toward Taiwanese independence. And so there's two things that have shifted now in this entire narrative. And so the timing is very important. One is Trump is, when Trump is willing to escalate something, he wants to win, and he's willing to do what is necessary to win, whereas a lot of other administrations just wanted to kind of kick the can down the road. Two, you actually have a significant political party, in fact, the currently ruling political party in Taiwan, that actually wants to move from a one China policy to a Taiwanese independence policy. So those two things together are what make the timing of all of this very, very significant. But the reason why Trump hasn't come right out and said this is our policy right now is because that theoretically, if you look at the rhetoric that the CCP has used in the past, that would be to them, that would be considered an act of war or act of war adjacent. Okay. So that is not, I'm going to raise your tariffs. That's, you are now threatening the autonomy of a portion of what we consider to be our own country.
Okay, this is great because somehow in answering that question, you set up the next question to actually be on topic.
Okay.
All right. It's from Mike Osman. It says, Nick, do you think the U.S. forces are prepared for a conventional war? The past 20 years have been asymmetric warfare, and all the veterans have experience with that style of warfare.
So that's a great question. A large focus for the United States over the last 20 years has been what we would call unconventional warfare or counterinsurgency operations, rather than what we would consider large-scale conventional combat operations like we saw in even Vietnam or Korea. There has been a concerted effort by the United States military to readjust a lot of their training. You can see this with things like NTC, which is the National Training Center in Southern California. You can see it with JRTC, Joint Readiness Training Center in Louisiana, where they are trying to get the United States military, at least the conventional forces, refocus on what we would consider to be large-scale conventional operations. Here's the thing I think that needs to be understood. Taiwan, I believe this. I don't know I'm not claiming that this is the strategy for the United States military. I don't believe that Taiwan actually needs U.S. ground troops. To the extent that they would have U.S. ground troops, I think it would be more in the realm of the special operations side. I don't think we would be sending the 82nd Airborne Division over there. Taiwan actually has 2 million reserves. The other thing to keep in mind here is that what Taiwan really needs from the United States is naval and air support. Because if China cannot maintain a logistical chain between mainland China and Taiwan, they cannot sustain an invasion force. So everybody talks about the 2 million person Chinese army. Okay, well, first of all, you can't deploy 2 million people. You need your military in other places. There's border conflicts with India. There's other problems with Vietnam. There's all kinds of issues, not to mention the fact that they are significantly worried about uprisings within their own country at some point. So you have all that to take into consideration. Now you've got to cross 100 miles of open ocean along the Taiwan Straits, and there's really only like a few months out of the year where the weather is conducive for something like that. So you have to maintain complete naval and air superiority in order to transfer at least a few 100,000 troops across open oceans in order to establish a beachhead and then maintain it against a Taiwanese military, which is then going to call up 2 million reserves and be able to fight you in a bunch of mountainous terrain. Like that is not an easy feat. I personally don't think the Chinese military is up to it technologically, logistically, or from a training capacity. So if the United States can just ensure that China does not get air superiority or naval superiority, then essentially I think Taiwan wins this war without us. The only thing that we would be concerned about then is, does China either go nuclear, which I don't think they would, or do they essentially just try to damage Taiwan so much, since Taiwan is it's the world's leading producer of semiconductors. Do they just attempt to essentially destroy their productive capacity in that way, which could very well be a Chinese strategy.
But you said earlier that us basically having this policy shift and let's say we announce that we're supporting Taiwanese independence.
Yeah.
If we did that and that was considered an act of war from China, wouldn't they attack us somehow?
No. They wanted to. I don't think they would directly attack the United States. They don't. Again, how would they? They don't have the capacity to do that. It is incredibly difficult. So the closest U.S. troops that we have to Taiwan are going to be in Okinawa. Right, so you've got a Marine Corps base, Army base, naval base in Okinawa. Then you've also got troops in South Korea and Japan, and then obviously Hawaii, which is where the bulk of your Pacific fleet would be coming from in order to provide air and naval defense for Taiwan. For China to attempt to directly attack those things, maybe Okinawa, but even then, I don't believe they have this. This isn't World War II where they can sneak up on us like they did at Pearl Harbor.
I don't know. They're sending all these little balloons across our country.
The way that they could potentially attack us that would actually have an impact, it wouldn't be through a conventional strike on U.S. forces. I think it would be actually messing with our grid. It would be cyber attacks, because one of the biggest vulnerabilities for the United States with respect to China right now, it has nothing to do with their military capacity. It has everything to do with the fact that Chinese telecoms have worked themselves into almost every single major data center within the United States. Because when the United States was rapidly trying to increase our ability to push the internet out and to facilitate communications, a lot of the people that were providing the software for that were coming from hostile nations, China being one of the biggest providers of it. So it's not that China would have to hack into our telecommunications
They're
network.
already in.
They're already there. They're already there. So if they wanted to do something that would debilitate us or cause us problems, that's how they would probably do it. The way that the other thing they would try to do from a military perspective is they would try to take out a carrier. And they would probably try to do something like that with like hypersonic weaponry or whatnot. And so the idea is that if they could generate enough economic and telecommunication problems within the United States, while at the same time that we lost a carrier, I mean, carriers have 5,000 people on them. Like if we sustain enough casualties and we're dealing with our own issues, you might have an uprising in the United States that said, this is not America first. This is not our war. Why are we involved? Because that's what most countries understand is the way that you beat the United States is within the minds of the electorate. You don't beat the United States military. So to answer that question, I think we would have some of our own hiccups because we haven't fought a large-scale conventional conflict in some time. But the technological dominance of the United States Navy and Air Force would still, I think it would overcome that, and we would still establish air and naval dominance fairly quickly if we decided to engage militarily.
We would just send the drag shows over there. Right.
We would export that.
Oh yeah, we're no longer doing that.
That's
in our
right.
military.
We're no longer, now that our military is no longer DEI decrepit, so we're doing much better. By the way,
Luke joined at perfect time.
Luke joined. By the way, if you're interested in perhaps joining our intentional community where you get to engage with us as we discuss all of these important topics and ask questions, I want you to go ahead and go to the IC. So go to the link in the description and become a member of the IC today. Join us for the members only recording of Making the Argument, not to mention the fact that once a month, Tina and I, we do a monthly meetup with Tina and myself where for a good couple hours, we just sit there, chat, ask questions. We have specific topics that our audience votes on that we discuss for that time. It's a great time to be able to chat with everybody. Not to mention some of the other benefits of becoming a member and not to mention the fact that it's a great way to support the show. So link in the description, join the IC if you want to have them play a more active role with respect to the topics we choose and the questions that we get, or the questions that we answer throughout the show. Live. Yeah. Okay.
So, on the question about how would China react if we kind of came out tomorrow and recognized Taiwan as an independent country, couple things. It's worth noting that we used to recognize Taiwan, the Republic of China, as the legitimate government of China. We had that recognition until the 1970s when we shifted our recognition to the PRC, which is run by the CCP. And in fact, actually, in the 1950s, we had a military defense treaty with Taiwan. Eisenhower actually went over to Taiwan and did a parade with Chiang Kai-shek and everything. We had a military agreement to defend Taiwan from an invasion. We ended up repealing that and shredding up that, ripping up that deal once we recognized mainland China. It was kind of a concession that we made as part of Nixon's opening up of China. Yeah. But we also passed the Taiwan Relations Act at the same time, which governs the de facto, not formal relationship that we have with Taiwan to this day, which also includes things like giving them military weapons and stuff like that. So we're still tied to Taiwan insofar as we have an informal relationship, and there's kind of an implicit assumption that the United States would defend Taiwan from an invasion, but we don't have a formal alliance with Taiwan like we did in the 50s.
Yeah, we don't have a defense treaty with them that would obligate the United States. I mean, again, it's not like the same it's not like the same sort of agreement that we have with NATO. One of the reasons why the United States has been so coy about this was because understand that immediately following the Civil War, it's not as if China was some sort of great superpower. I mean, that high population, but if you look at what was going on through Maoist China, not only was it communist, but they were regularly devastating their own people. I mean, 40 million people died as a result of internal policy of the PRC and specifically Mao through things like the Great Leap Forward, the Cultural Revolution. The Great Leap Forward was his absolutely failed collectivist model where he literally, China was going to be number one in developing steel. And so he took a bunch of farmers out of the fields in order to, make steel and make iron. And he put a bunch of bureaucrats in charge of farming, and lo and behold, millions of people starved to death.
Oh, and he killed all the sparrows too.
He killed all the sparrows because the sparrows ate some of the grain. Well, you know what sparrows also eat? Locusts. And so we actually did a Y minute on that. If you want to learn more about how killing sparrows actually helped, contribute to the overall famine that took place during the Great Leap Forward. And it was such an overwhelming disaster that there started to be people kind of dissenting toward Mao's leadership. Mao then decided to, it was clever how he did this, because he didn't just get right to the Cultural Revolution. At first, it was this: we're going to have openness. We're going to have people being able to come forward and discuss the problems on behalf of the people. Well, as soon as people did that, he identified everybody that was essentially going to be a threat to his regime, and then mobilized the Red Guards, which were a lot of his, lo and behold, college students and youth, his youth army, launched the Cultural Revolution. They just butchered intellectuals, people with glasses, like anybody that was considered trapped in Western ways of thinking, which is funny, being that he was following Karl Marx. But anyways, and then once that was done, what did Mao do next? Well, he got rid of the
He purged the Red Guards.
He purged the Red Guards because they had served their purpose. But the point is all this was going on at this particular time. And so it made sense to have the relationship that we did with Taiwan. But as time went on, and this became more of a question of attempting to break away, again, interrupt that relationship between the PRC and the Soviet Union, opening up China at that point made a lot of sense from
a realpolitik perspective. It made sense to drive a wedge between two Marxist communist nations because people kind of forget this, that all ideologies and political movements have a diversity within them in terms of different factions, belief systems. There's struggle within parties, right? Within ideologies. And Marxism and communism is no different from any other ideology in that respect. And there was real divides between Mao and the Soviet Union, and then also Mao's successors in the Soviet Union. And you had the Sino-Soviet split in the 1960s that the United States exploited in order to drive a wedge between the two most powerful communist states in the world. And it was arguably very successful. But what happened over the course of decades, generations, is that the situation in Taiwan changed. And Nick was hinting at this a little bit. I kind of want to go a little bit deeper on this front, because I think this explains a lot of what is currently happening today and why it makes things just a lot muddier than most people would anticipate.
Yeah, I mean, we should definitely talk a little bit about the current situation in Taiwan, because again, I think in the minds of most Americans, PRC bad, and I would agree with that, right? People's Republic of China, that's the communist Chinese. And then Taiwan good, right? I mean, Taiwan is largely a free society. They have, free and stable elections. They generally have a market economy, which is based on private property rights. They protect freedom of speech. They are also having their own issues with what we would call like wokeness. In fact, the current ruling party of Taiwan is all about, woke ideology in many respects, while at the same time still being anti-communist. And that's because, again, from their perspective, we associate a lot of the wokeistas in the United States as being very friendly toward Marxism or socialism, right? There's a different dynamic over in Taiwan, because they've constantly lived under the threat of potential annihilation from the PRC. And so they don't necessarily have the same view toward communism, because communism there is not just Marxist ideology. It's not just socialist ideology or collectivism. Communism over there is the people that have been threatening our very existence. And so it's important to understand that there's a historical dynamic there that is different. And it allows kind of that woke progressivism, which we largely associate with kind of socialist tendencies within the United States, to actually be anti-communist and very, very woke at the same time. So it's not really a contradiction over there. And that's an important thing to keep in mind. The other thing too to keep in mind is while China, from a GDP per capita level, a lot of people talk about China being this economic powerhouse, and people are finally starting to wake up to the fact that while that was definitely something that began, I would argue, in the 1980s and certainly went into hyperdrive in the early 2000s, what we're starting to see right now is that a lot of the internal policies that China used in order to achieve this economic development was really built on a very, very poor foundation, because they are still ultimately an authoritarian regime. They don't have genuine property rights in the way that we think about it. You have central bureaucracies, able to take away your company at any given time if they choose. And that doesn't provide the best environment for long-term investment. It doesn't provide the best environment for long-term economic progress. And we're now starting to see China on the cusp as having a huge population collapse. Not to mention the fact that their overall manufacturing sector, their tech sectors, all of that stuff is in a lot of danger right now.
Their real estate market.
The real estate market is we think we know what real estate bubbles are. China's about to show us what they can actually be. And it's just insane. By the same token, Taiwan, on the other hand, has had fairly consistent economic growth for some time, not to mention the fact that I'm not a big government intervention into the economy sort of guy, but one of the things that the government did over there, and I would argue to some degree it was a deliberate attempt by the Taiwanese government to make themselves essential to other powers that could rival China, was they invested heavily on developing a tech sector that has made them, again, I think the world's largest producer of semiconductors.
They call it the Silicon Shield.
Yeah.
Because they produce something. It's about 70% of the semiconductor chips in the world come out of Taiwan, and out of that,
because they do a very good job of it.
most of them come out of one company in particular, TSMC. And what happened was that it's funny, their origin story, because the Taiwanese government basically helped start the company, and they went to the people of Taiwan and were like, everybody needs to chip in to found this company, and we're gonna. They did private. It's not a state-run.
No,
understand? It's not a state-run company.
It was a public-private partnership, if you will.
In a way, it started off. In a way, it started off like that. It is. TSMC is a publicly for a long time. I had a lot of TSMC. I sold it because they have what's called what I like to call the Xi Jinping discount.
Yeah.
And so they trade much lower than they should be trading, probably 20 or 30% higher than they currently are. The market always discounts their price because there's always a chance.
Oh yeah. Whenever your
invaded.
company could theoretically be bombed by the largest military in the world.
Yeah. They traded a bit of a discount.
It impacts your stock price.
But point is that because there's such a critical component of things like AI, for example, or just really the tech sector as a whole, this makes Taiwan in some ways indispensable to the global economy. And that's why they call it the Silicon Shield. And so, yes, you can, on one hand, you can say this is a violation of free market principles. The government shouldn't be setting up businesses and, encouraging people to invest in it and stuff like that. But on the other hand, if you look at it from a national security standpoint rather than a market intervention standpoint, it was actually
made a lot of sense.
It made a lot of strategic sense from a purely realpolitik perspective. It's important to understand, though, who is driving some of these policy decisions in Taiwan, because remember how I talked about earlier that there was the Sino-Soviet split and you had divisions within the communist movement? Well, you have divisions within Taiwan as well, right? They're a multi-party system. And it's not it's the way that I think that the way that Taiwanese politics operates is not it doesn't really function in a way that most Americans, I think, would grasp at first glance. It seems almost a bit counterintuitive. So you've got historically two main parties. There are third parties that have popped up in recent years, but historically there's two main parties in Taiwan. You have the DPP, the Democratic People's Party, and the KMT, which if I try to actually pronounce their name, it's Kuomintang. I would butcher it. It's a Chinese name.
Good.
But the KMT historically, as Nick briefly said, were the party that ran mainland China. They were the party that unified China during the warlord period. Warlord period was in the aftermath of the collapse of the Qing Empire, the last dynasty of China. This is 100 years ago in 1912. China shattered into a million different states. You had local warlords that just ran their own region. It was hilarious chaos, but chaos everywhere. One political movement came together and unified the entire country under the rule of Chiang Kai-shek, and that was the KMT. The KMT ran the country until the 1930s, when the CCP, which had started earlier, became a large enough political force to challenge them, and that kickstarted the Chinese Civil War. The KMT drove them out of the cities, particularly places like Shanghai. That led to the Long March, where Mao took the remnants of the CCP, through the rural countryside and the mountains. He met with the local peasants, the CCP went from being this intellectual group of, urban elites, basically, that were all Marxists, basically our political situation today, to being a peasant-led rural communist coalition, which is radically different than the way that we think of left-right politics in the U.S. today.
Yeah.
That triggered the Civil War. That pauses because Japan invades. You had this thing called World War II that happened.
Yeah.
So that was put on hold. World War II ends. Japan gets defeated. We defeat them with the Chinese. The Civil War restarts again once the Japanese are defeated. Now, this time, the communists defeat the KMT. The KMT flee to Taiwan, and they basically set up their rump state over there. Well, the KMT are, in some ways, the right-wing party, right? They claim to be the nationalist party of China. That's basically how the translation works, right? Well, on one hand, yeah, they're right-wing, but on another hand, they actually want closer relations with the mainland. So everything I said before was just kind of recapping what Nick said, but this is the important part. The KMT wants closer relations with the mainland because they have not given up on the hope of reunifying China under their rule.
Yeah.
Their logic goes something like this. The filthy commies are running the mainland. Communism is unsustainable in the long term. It might take 50 years. It might take 100 years. But eventually, the CCP will implode, and there will be a power vacuum, and we want to fill it and reunify with the mainland under our rule. The nationalists, the KMT will reunify China. It'll be the Republic of China again.
Yeah.
But that is in contrast to the DPP, which is the Democratic People's Party. The DPP, they don't care about mainland China at all. They're actually rabidly anti-communist, but they're also socially progressive and woke and liberal. And again, this, from an American perspective, this sounds like a contradiction.
Even make sense. Yeah.
They are militantly anti-CCP and anti-communist, but they're also very woke, very progressive, very socially liberal. And they don't want closer relations with the mainland like the KMT does, despite the fact that the KMT literally fought a civil war with the mainland. They're hostile to the mainland, and they want an independent and separate Taiwan that is its own country that has basically no connection to the mainland whatsoever. And if you look at the history of elections, the KMT for a long time ran Taiwan first as a military dictatorship.
Yeah.
And then after the transition to democracy, they kept winning until about 20 years ago. And then it became a contested system. But really over the last 10 years, the KMT has waned because memory of the Civil War has also waned. And so older generations vote for the KMT, but the younger crowd, they don't view themselves as Chinese. They view themselves as Taiwanese. Yeah. And they're voting for the DPP.
Well, and we've also, and it's interesting we say 20 years ago, because the old school arguments that were taking place between East and West, between capitalism and communism, essentially morphed into this latest battle that has taken place between left and right, which doesn't fit within the normal patterns. And that's again, I think you.
We were talking about it right before the podcast.
You verbalize that very well. It's like it's important to understand that it's the left-wing party in Taiwan that doesn't want to be associated with the Chinese mainland. And it's the conservative party that wants closer relationships with the PRC in the hopes that in the not so distant future, all of China will once again be unified under their control.
All right. So there are two questions. I'm sorry.
Go for it.
Two questions. One is, okay, where did it go? 1 second.
Oh, you're getting all mad with me. But
no.
I see them right here. The one from Loyal to Law.
Okay, so Loyal to Law says, what would be better, Trump's policy recognizing Taiwan's independence if they decide to do that, or stay with the one China policy? Which one would be better? And then the other question is from Erica Ray, is the DPP woke because of U.S. aid for funding projects? That's a good question.
There is no question that the United States has spent a lot of money on exporting woke.
Yeah.
And again, a lot of that started off through LGBTQ plus components, because again, critical theory doesn't play out the same way in Taiwan as it plays out within the United States. But this whole idea of woke ideology and identification, self-identify as whatever you want in Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Yes, the United States, the West in general, the United States specifically, academia, we have to bear a lot of the responsibility for that. And what Doge has uncovered is just how much of your tax dollars were being used to export woke all over the world for the last few decades. So I can't say to what extent U.S. aid funding is responsible. But there's absolutely zero question in my mind that U.S. funding and U.S. academia has had a heavy influence on exporting that sort of ideology. When you see it in other places, it's usually a result of an influence from the United States or European countries.
Okay, and so the other question being, what would be better?
That's the one. That one's going to take a while.
I want to take a shot at Erica's question for a second.
Okay.
There's no doubt in my mind that we are funding global. I mean, the term that I've used, not me. I didn't come up with it, but the term that exists is the global American empire. It's our biggest export is wokeism. That's our form of like imperialism in a way.
What a shame.
I have no doubt that, with the exception of dollars, going back to the milkshake podcast that we did, our biggest export is wokeism, and Taiwan is no exception to that. They're a recipient of American wokeism. But at the same token, the DPP is a woke party, not because of U.S. aid or American foreign policy. The DPP is a woke party because they're a liberal party. And wokeism, from my perspective, is basically end-stage liberalism. And so it doesn't really matter, in a way, whether or not the United States is funding woke programs around the world. That's simply accelerating a natural process anyway. By virtue of being a liberal party, the DPP was inevitably going to become what it currently is. And so it's not really a product of American foreign policy. It's simply being exacerbated, arguably, by American foreign policy. But they're not a conservative, party in the way that the KMT is. And so it's not surprising that the DPP would become what they currently are. Now, on to the second point. Personally, I don't know about you, Nick, but I would prefer the KMT's approach.
Oh, so, okay, real quick. So we're shifting now. We're going to ask loyalty laws. So let's reiterate that question. It was, what would be better? What would be better for Trump to essentially recognize Taiwanese independence, or for us to stick with the one China policy? So you're saying stick with the one China policy.
Well, and it's also a question as to whether would it be better for Taiwan or would it be better for us? And are those two things mutually exclusive, or can they be both?
So let's discuss that. Would it be better? Would it be better for the United States to? Here's the first thing to understand. I don't see Taiwan running very, very hard in the direction of Taiwanese independence without negotiating something with the United States to ensure that they still get protection. Because let's face it, as much as I think it would be incredibly difficult for China to take Taiwan, it becomes significantly easier if the United States is not guaranteeing Taiwan's independence. And if you had an administration that essentially said, oh, you want to go ahead and declare your independence without first talking to the United States, which we all know you're relying upon for military and technical support in order to defeat a Chinese invasion, good luck, especially under an administration that isn't as comfortable with so much of the United States' technological market being dependent upon foreign semiconductor manufacturing. So that's why I say I don't see the DPP, it as motivated as they might be, I don't see the DPP making that decision for Taiwan without first solidifying that the United States will have their back if they make it. That's step one. Step two is what's best for the United States. So let's get into that question of, okay, just screw you, China. Taiwan's independent. We're now just going to acknowledge what's already been the reality, and you can deal with it because what are you going to do about it? Or do we say, nah, we're going to stick with our one China policy? What do you think and why? What do you think would be better for the United States and why?
The perfect case scenario is a unified China under the KMT. That would be the best case scenario.
I tend to agree. The other thing too is, a lot of people look at this as like, this is ridiculous. Do you honestly believe that the KMT in Taiwan, right? Taiwan, yes, a prosperous country, a populous country, but nothing compared to the overall economic, military, or population strength of mainland China. Do you really think the political party in Taiwan, which can't even win the elections in Taiwan, is going to eventually be the party which actually governs China?
Of course. And
the answer is, the next couple of decades could significantly alter the way that we look at that. Significantly alter. I think it'll probably be more than 20 years. I said next couple of decades, probably more than that. But let's imagine a world if Taiwan says, okay, we're independent, they give up any claim to actually ruling China, and the U.S. backs it, that is going to cause some kind of crisis in the region. I don't know how it totally manifests, but I'm not sure what it looks like, and it could potentially involve U.S. military forces in order to ensure Taiwan's independence. The other component here, though, is if you maintain the one China policy, one, you don't find yourself in a position to actually encourage warfare within the region. Two, I'm sorry, but the PRC is in a horrible place right now. And it's only going to get significantly worse because not only are they facing significant economic challenges, not only are they facing, countries like India somewhat on the ascendancy within the region, not only are they facing a variety of other, complicated issues with respect to trade, they have 30 million more young men than they have women. That's not just an inconvenient thing for trying to find a bride. You do not want to have 30 million young men who see no future for themselves and blame your regime for it. You don't want that.
There's a question here. It says if we recognize Taiwan and China tries to invade, could that not feasibly stretch their resources so far that they topple their current regime?
Only if they fail.
This is a conversation we've had before. I think it would. But the question is a faltering Soviet regime decided to kind of give itself up peacefully for the most part. There was still hostility. There was still, but nowhere near what we thought the collapsing Soviet Union might do with thousands of nuclear warheads, right? And millions of troops. I don't know. I don't know what a collapsing communist Chinese regime looks like. Historically, China has broken into warring factions several times.
I wrote
history.
Hamilton will tell you about this. I wrote a very, very long YouTube script for a video that we never put out. Maybe one day I'll put it out. If we ever published it, it would probably be an hour to an hour and a half long. And it goes through the history of China, looking at the dynastic cycles.
Yeah.
And the way that it works is, and this is almost like an eternal law of Chinese geopolitics. You can go back well over 2,000 years and find evidence of this, where you have a dynasty that unifies the country. This is actually the opening lines of the Romance of the Three Kingdoms, which is one of the most important pieces of literature in Chinese history.
Incredible.
The empire long divided must unite, long united must divide. And that is the story of Chinese politics. You have a dynasty that unifies the country.
Yeah.
It goes through a golden age. That dynasty becomes corrupt for a variety of reasons. Future emperors kind of lose the mandate of heaven. The system collapses in on itself. That dynasty gets deposed. The country fractures into a million pieces. There's a warring state civil war period until finally somebody cobbles enough support together to reunify the country under their rule. They establish a new dynasty and the cycle begins anew. And the last time supposedly that this process played out was about 100 to 200 years ago. You had beginning in the 1830s with the Opium Wars with the British, where the Qing dynasty lost those wars and then started to disintegrate. They had multiple civil wars. They had the Taiping Rebellion, which is the bloodiest civil war in all of human history. 60 million people were killed. They lost multiple wars against the Japanese, against the Russians pressured them to cede land. The French pressured them for ports. China was being carved up. They had this period called the Century of Humiliation. And that lasted until finally the Qing get deposed. You have a republic. Again, it goes back to what I said earlier. They have the warlord states, the civil war, the KMT lose to the CCP. And so China's history, that is their warlord period, right? And so in a way, you could argue that the cycle has actually not stopped. It's continued. There is a dynasty in power, and that dynasty is the CCP dynasty. It's not a dynasty in the way that we would traditionally call an imperial dynasty sitting on the dragon throne, but in a way they do have that, and they have this period where they're stabilizing their regime that's under Mao, and then they have the golden era, which is the opening up period, the massive economic growth, the market reforms of the 1980s and 90s, and then you have a stagnation period, and then you have a decline period, and then what will come is is a collapse.
Well, I think the other thing that's interesting to look at here too is the Soviet Union lasted for about 90 years. China's closing in on that 90-year. Now, obviously, very different circumstances, but and they've had a very, very different evolution with respect to their economic policy and things of that nature as well. But
I'm so sorry. I was just going to ask one last question.
yeah.
Do you think that the situation with Hong Kong and China could play into this anywhere?
So, okay, yes. Now, again, Hong Kong economic powerhouse when it was under British control in large part because it was the freest economy in the world.
But they've been tamping down rebellions, like COVID hit and of course erased that. But
when the 99-year lease was up and Hong Kong reverted back to China, the agreement was that Hong Kong was essentially going to be able to operate as an autonomous entity, which essentially belonged to the PRC.
One country, two systems.
Yeah. Well, that went away fairly quick. And so here's what I think is important to understand. To the original question of if Taiwan declared independence and conflict broke out, could that be basically the nail in the coffin of the PRC? Because it would essentially, if they felt forced into war for the purpose of reclaiming Taiwan and failed, the regime would collapse. The difference is that there's been regimes that have essentially, there's been transfers of power within the PRC, obviously, since Mao. But would this be enough to essentially kind of destroy the PRC stranglehold on mainland China? I think it could be, not in isolation, but because of everything else that is going on at the same time. So if the Chinese people, who I believe, like the average Chinese person probably believes that of course they would take Taiwan if they went after it. And obviously the propaganda would be the vile Americans intervened or whatnot. But look, at some point that doesn't put food on the table. I think if China suddenly had to revert a ton of resources, they would probably draft up a significant portion of those, young males for the purposes of invading Taiwan, lost hundreds of thousands of people in the effort, and barely got across the Taiwanese Straits and were able to maintain it because, the United States assisted exclusively through naval and air power. Taiwan was able to come back. Yeah, I think that could be, I think that could be the what breaks the back of the regime.
And then you would just have a restructuring across the board.
Well, and then what you would end up, so let's go into the Warring States period, right? You might even get into this renewed Warring States party or period within China, right? Where now all of a sudden the KMT, or let's say the KMT, now can operate with certain dissident or subversive elements within places like Hong Kong, within places like Shanghai, within places like Beijing, because some of these cities have actually had a taste of what capitalism looks like, and they like it. There's a lot of other people that are just so frustrated with the regime that would essentially go with anybody that was promising them something better. I don't think there's any scenario where the KMT just rides in on its white horse and goes, we're in charge now. But I do think what you could have is a fairly long fight within China itself on who's actually going to control the country. But I think the communists would largely be done. I'm not putting money on that on Vegas, but I think the Chinese declaring war, attempting to invade Taiwan, failing to do so, would definitely be the end of Xi Jinping. And I think it'd probably be the end of the PRC.
I just don't want it to get to that point, which kind of, I'll wrap up on this because I know that we're pressed for time here,
Yeah.
But I just don't want us to be forcing a situation in which we get dragged into a war over Taiwan. I don't see how that's America first.
Mm-hmm.
I think that America first in this instance is maintain the status quo.
Yeah.
Don't provoke a war. Don't feed the DPP's obsession with Taiwanese independence. Not because I'm pro-CCP,
Yeah.
but because I don't want the United States to be dragged into a war with another major power in the Pacific. I would prefer the KMT model, which is sit back, trade, have friendly relations insofar as we can tolerate each other's existence.
Yeah.
And
We're not constantly threatening to kill one another.
Yes. The KMT's approach to all of this is basically, however long it takes,
Yeah.
communism is not sustainable. And if we sit back, even if it's 100 years, we can wait them out, the CCP out, and let's all just get rich while we're sitting there waiting.
Yeah. I tend to agree with that position as well. I think it's far better for the United States to from what I know right now, and I'm obviously not getting the same security briefs that Donald Trump is, right? Interestingly enough, we have had the sitting national security advisor, Mike Waltz, on the podcast before, but I'm not getting the same briefs that Mike is giving the president right now. But based off of what I know, I completely agree. I don't think that we've been because here's the problem. Sometimes when you try to accelerate something, you get end results you didn't anticipate. And that goes to a question that Erica asked. Do you think China sees war as a solution for the shortage of women causing unhappiness in men in China? I guarantee you that Xi Jinping is looking at 30 million, single men and thinking, gosh, a war might be a great way to occupy these guys. Right now,
Except for the fact that those men are needed in order to support the aging population.
Well, but wait a second here. There's a very old adage that war abroad is peace at home. Xi Jinping is, I think that civil unrest in China is something that could be a very, very real possibility within a relatively short period of time. And when I say that, I mean within a decade. I don't know how widespread it would be, but I could see it manifesting itself. War abroad, and then, basically just trying to find some sort of enemy that they can point everybody's attention at and make it the source of all their problems and ills is absolutely something that China could potentially try. Because quite frankly, if they don't come up with something soon, they're in a lot of trouble. And to Christian's point, one of the reasons why I think the Soviet Union had the disintegration that it did was because the sort of acceleration that took place toward the end of the Soviet Union was not us engaging in open warfare with the Soviet Union so much as it was creating an arms race that they just simply could not sustain within their economy. And it was allowing the absolute bloat and economic absurdity of communism and socialism essentially overwhelm them to a point where they couldn't hide it anymore. There was no amount of propaganda that we're going to convince their own people that this was a good idea. Next thing you know, McDonald's and Metallica shows up to Russia, right? And the Soviet Union is no more. I would much rather have the Chinese people come to the conclusion that this just isn't working and choose something for themselves and then decide organically what that should look like, than for the United States to meddle in such a way thinking, we're going to accelerate this and break the back of Xi Jinping's regime. Or you're going to cause sufficient motivation for the Chinese people to unify around Xi Jinping. And then even if you do end up hurting them in the long run, how many people had to die in the meantime? And so I'm with Christian on this. I honestly believe, as much as I support Taiwan, and I do, I think the better long-term strategy, both for the United States and Taiwan and for mainland China, is for the United States to not try to play chess with the Chinese people.
Yeah, because loss of life, it's a lot of loss of life, and every life is value.
Yeah. All righty. Well, let me go ahead and close all this up. Look, I thank you to Tina, thank you to Christian, because again, they're the ones that largely, kind of identified this news story as it was popping up and got some of the information together so that we could all talk about it. But this is an interesting question as we go forward. There's been again, what does America first mean? We've discussed some of this before. America first doesn't mean certain countries last, and it doesn't mean that we isolate ourselves. Nope, that's never what America first has meant. What it's always meant, at least I hope, and at least as I have understood it, is we're going to prioritize the American people and American interests above everybody else's. That doesn't mean we don't want strong allies. It doesn't mean that we don't want strong trading partners, but we're no longer going to put the interests of our own people secondary to the interests and concerns of other countries and other nations. And as I look at what is going on right now, I think Trump is doing what Trump typically does. He's engaging in hardball negotiation with countries that he believes have been attempting to put the United States as an economic disadvantage, and quite frankly have done so with the approval of a lot of administrations that came before Trump. I think he's trying to rectify that. I think he's willing to use everything within the quiver of executive power in order to put the United States in the best possible position in order to do things like renegotiate trade deals or to get foreign countries to stop engaging in the sort of subversive behavior that China has toward the United States. The sort of corporate espionage, the infiltration of our telecommunications networks, the infiltration of drugs and people into our country. China has been complicit in all of this. And Trump knows that China can stop it if they want to. And so now he's creating the various economic as well as international, but even potentially military conditions to try to put the United States in the best possible position to get China, as well as other countries, to do the things that they should have been doing all along. And quite frankly, I want to give them room to maneuver. So hope that explains everything. I hope you are leaving this episode with a better understanding of what is going on with respect to the One China policy. And again, thank you for your questions. Thank you for your participation during this. Once again, if you would like to be someone that can interject and comment on the live streaming of this episode, please consider joining our IC, our intentional community. Link is in the description. Once again, thank you for joining us, and we will see you next episode.